Gibraltar is at a crossroads. The treaty will provide us with frontier fluidity and a new relationship with Spain and the EU. But it's been a long and difficult journey to get there. On Viewpoint tonight, Gibraltar's chief ministers take us from past to present. Hello and welcome to a very special edition of Viewpoint. No one knows better than those who've served Gibraltar's highest office how challenging the path towards greater autonomy and self-sufficiency has been over the decades. The evacuation and the repatriation, the closed frontier years, rebuilding the economy, continued hostility from Spain, bilateral and joint sovereignty talks, Brexit, COVID, and, of course, treaty negotiations. Much of it overseen by the gentleman I have at my side tonight. And it gives me the greatest of pleasures to welcome on set Fabian Picardo.
Good evening.
Sir Peter Caruana.
Hi, good evening.
Sir Bossano. And Adolfo Canepa. Thank you so much for coming in. I think this is the first time we've ever had all four of you here, so it's great to have you. The floor will be mostly yours tonight, I can tell you that. So I'm going to prompt you with some topics and a few questions here and there, but feel free to sort of chip in and talk as freely as you like. The floor is yours, as I say. But we are going to delve into the past and try to understand how our relationship, our international relations have evolved and changed and how that's shaped the Gibraltar that we see today. But we're going to start off with the treaty, first of all, just touching on it, because the treaty is about to be signed and ratified, and that will define Gibraltar's relationship with Spain and the EU. Can we just take a moment to reflect on Gibraltar's place in the world as it is now compared to what it was 50 years ago? Who would like to start? Chief Minister?
Well, if you look at that span of time, you have around this table children of the 1940s, I mean, Adolfo and Joe, if I'm not wrong, a child of the late 1950s in Peter, and a child of the 1970s. I think we've probably seen it all. And if you think about what Gibraltar was during the war years, that our loved ones were taken out of here, that even bringing them back was a struggle, which is what the AACR was all about. And you look at where we are today, sitting at the top table when our issues are being negotiated, setting out the position in respect of those issues when they relate to our responsibilities under the Constitution. I think if Joshua Hassan was here with us and he looked at the Gibraltar that he first started the process of representing, and the Gibraltar that I have the honour and privilege to lead today, he would not believe how far he was able to push and pull, and how far we've been able to take it through the process that the gentleman around me led, and I was happy enough to inherit.
Sir Joe?
Look, I think the way that we've developed has been almost entirely driven by the threats that there have been. But I certainly think that the exodus over the Second World War. I mean, I left Gibraltar when I was 3 or 4 months old, and I wasn't giving a lot of trouble by then. But look, I finished up in North Africa and then in London, where, you know, I always mention the bit in London because it shows something about we think they are doing the best for us. They put us in London in the places that were empty because it was too dangerous for the Londoners who had been taken to the countryside, right? But the fact that the AACR came into the picture as the entity that fought for many, many, many years. I came in one of the final ones in 1948 to remind the British government of the duty that they had to bring us all back. That campaign really is the beginning where we are saying things to the UK instead of just being told by the UK what we have to do. So that's an important point.
Mr. Canepa, you were there, of course, by Sir Joshua Hassan's side for many, many years. And it was a time we've seen in declassified documents, Gibraltarians described as ignorant and excitable Latins. So can you just tell us I mean, we're going to talk about the birth of the AACR in a moment, but what do you remember about the British attitude to Gibraltar back then?
Almost practically a colonial attitude. One of our young members, Ernest Montado, the great Chief Secretary, once addressed the Grammarian Association, and he pointed out in very dramatic ways the attitude that as school children we had to face with the MOD. Now, Joe wasn't a sportsman, but I was. And to go to the naval grounds, which were owned by the MOD, and not to feel wanted, look, many Gibraltarians thought that if they came across an army major, that they had to cross to the other side and make way for him. It was a Gibraltar in which the military were totally dominant, and in which the government of Gibraltar was a colonial government run by civil servants with top UK civil servants. It was not a very pleasant place in which to grow up.
So, Peter, do you have any recollections?
Well, it's not really just about recollection. I think it's well documented. I think throughout the 50-year period that you've described and has been spoken about already, the one common feature, in my view, is this community of 30-odd thousand people, 38 now, the ability to look after themselves, to protect and to achieve for themselves. No one's ever given us any of the achievements that we have made. You know, and you can almost trace that success over 50 years by a series of landmark events. The determination, our repatriation, and our evacuation, and then our repatriation. The need to establish parity, for example, would be one of the features that Joe fought for as a trade union leader. That has had a huge subsequent socio-economic effect on this Gibraltar's economy. Then the need to build a new modern economy based on following the closure of the naval dockyard. That then gave us the economic power to look after ourselves politically even more effective. The fight for the constitutions, the fight, for example, against joint sovereignty, the fact that the UK no longer speaks for, the fact that we now speak for ourselves, negotiate for ourselves, as the government has demonstrated in this treaty. And the fact that, you know, the idea of the United Kingdom now telling us what we have to have and negotiating it for us and delivering it, that is finished for Gibraltar. These are the landmarks in our journey as a people. And the result is the huge socio-economic lifestyle that Gibraltar enjoys and has enjoyed over many decades now, the degree and the quality and competence of the self-governance that we enjoy, and the ability that we have to defend ourselves, punching above our weights, as we always have, on an international stage. I think that's the picture that I would draw of the 50-year journey.
Well, Sir Joshua Hassan isn't here, but of course he remains very much a large figure in politics in Gibraltar. So what prompted him? I know it was the fact that we wanted to repatriate Gibraltarians back to Gibraltar and give them more rights. But how did his voice rise above all others?
Well, you look at the history of that, and you look at how Hassan comes. Indeed, so many of our great leaders have come from the trade union movement, and Hassan in the beginning is with the trade unions, with the workers,
well, actually,
the voice of the workers.
I think the unique difference is that in almost all the places where there have been Labour parties, that there is a trade union movement first, and then when they feel there is a ceiling of what they can do, then they go into politics. But here, the Association for the Advancement of Civil Rights preceded the union.
But remember, the full name of the AACR was the GLP AACR.
Later, 25 years
much
later.
later.
GLP AACR. And so that there was that link to the labour movement. There was that fight for our land, fight for our rights. I mean, there's a story, perhaps Adolfo and Joe will know it better, but which is repeated to me very often, which I remember, which is that Sir Joshua used to say, the governor listens more to his Batman than he listens to me. Well, the governor today doesn't have a Batman. Yeah? The governor today is a partner and a colleague, and we work together on the things that matter to all of us, because we have responsibilities and obligations under the Constitution. But I think there was that call that the people made through Joshua Hassan for a Gibraltarian voice to stand up for the Gibraltarian issues.
But why Joshua Hassan? What I'm just trying to pinpoint.
He was an educated working man.
Yeah.
So Joshua was brought in by a group of workers. You have to go to the end of 1942. By then it was clear that the Allies were going to win the war. And this group of men, Albert Rieser was one of them, the trade unionist, were already thinking, what kind of Gibraltar do we want after the war? We want a Gibraltar in which we have civil rights, which we haven't had in the past, in which our people come back to a better Gibraltar. And so they founded this party with the name, self-evident. They brought Sir Joshua in. Alberto Rieser was the president, Sir Joshua was the vice president, but when they formed the union, they had a workers' committee which then formed the Gibraltar Confederation of Labour. Albert Rieser moved to the union and Sir Joshua became the leader of the party. And perhaps the most significant policy that they adopted right from the beginning, I'll sum up in one word, Gibraltarianization. They looked to a future in which Gibraltarians would take over the running of Gibraltar and build and construct a better Gibraltar for all of us.
And that, Ross and Adolfo, that is the key. Starting with Adolfo, there is a vision. There is a vision of a Gibraltarian that belongs in his homeland, Gibraltar, that we are responsible to make a success of the place, that other people, however friendly, even Britain, do not have the same amount of meat on the barbecue as we have in respect of Gibraltar, and that because we've all, in every generation, not just of citizen, but of political leader, shared this same core vision, this same core conviction about Gibraltar, that we have all worked in our different styles, with our different political perspectives, but ultimately it has been working for a common vision, for a common journey, for the people of Gibraltar in Gibraltar. So each of us around this table, and of course Sir Joshua, who has played perhaps historically a very, very important role, have built on the achievements of our predecessors. And because we have never wanted to abandon the common vision and the common journey, there has been no retreat. We've always moved forward, each of us acknowledging hopefully the achievements of our predecessor, that's probably right, just, and building and hopefully handing to our successors a better platform, or a platform from which he could take the reins.
So
I think anyway, you know, in the normal colonial relationship, right? All the natives tend to be much more on the same page until after they become independent. And if we look at what has been happening with decolonization, right? In all the decolonizations which have been granted reluctantly, and where there has been, in many cases, you know, people actually killing UK forces because they wanted their independence, all the pro-decolonization parties fought for one thing, and that was for the right to rule themselves, right? So, having put us in a colonial context, I think the mold was that mold. We were not like the Channel Islands or the Isle of Man that had a different relationship with the United Kingdom. We were where the colonies were.
But were you aware of that back then? Were you aware of the relationships between the other colonies and Britain? I mean, did you look at what was happening?
Well, I think we did once it was taken up by the UN. I think probably before the UN, in Gibraltar, probably people accepted that there was a three-tier society, like there were 3 toilets in the dockyard, you know? And you know, when you say to people in the United Kingdom that the nomenclature in Gibraltar was that you were British or alien, and that alien didn't mean a different planet, it meant something other than British. So it was only the concept that they had at that time, but this was something that was still going on in the 1930s, the 1940s, and 1950s, right? So the planet consisted of 2 kinds of human beings: aliens and British.
Yeah, use it until.
And I think in other colonies, the fight was for independence, a struggle against Britain for independence. We've never struggled for that, so we have channeled our energies in a slightly different focus. We have focused on the development of our self-governance, the development of socio-economic prosperity for our people, the achievement of political security in terms of our sovereignty and Spain's claim and the recognition of our right to self-determination. So we haven't really lost energy fighting for independence, which then fritters away, and then, as Joe says, you get left with very little unity. We are still united. Even if we achieve what the most that we can, we will still, hopefully, subject to domestic political differences, obviously, but we will still be united by this common vision that Gibraltar should be the safest, most socio-economically and politically secure homeland for the people as possible. And that would not change.
And there's a nuance there which isn't in all the other colonies, which is this British we are, British we stay element, which we all agree on. And we're all still nonetheless pushing towards independence administratively. So this autonomy, which is the greatest level of autonomy short of independence, which we all also agree on, while saying British we are, British we stay, but we are British ourselves, and there I think is where it's important to note also the huge contribution of Bob Belisa and his fight in the early 1980s on British nationality, which was not something, again, as Peter said, not something we were given. We even had to fight to have that British nationality.
Anything of value we have achieved.
But that was very determinative because, to slice and dice a little what Joe was saying before, we were British, but we were not British citizens. We were British Overseas Territory citizens, which was a different categorization
so you didn't have the same rights
of
as
British.
other Brits. Yeah.
So we take the step up that we become full British citizens, no difference there, but the class of British citizen that runs Gibraltar. And ironically, to do the final twist over what Joe was saying, the world starts just after the war where there are Brits and there are aliens. And it finishes today where in our records there are Gibraltarians and other British. That is to say, in a categorization, somebody who is a British Gibraltarian is registered as a Gibraltarian. Somebody who is British but not a Gibraltarian is other British.
It's also true and fair to recognise that Britain has herself psychologically moved forward.
Yes, indeed.
In a way that acknowledges and recognises our right to feel in the way that we are describing here. Britain now feels much less proprietorial, much less imposing, much more understanding that we want to run our own affairs and that she is responsible, but more in a sort of benevolent uncle way than in a sort of draconian father sort of way.
Let's step back to...
It wasn't easy for Sir Joshua.
Yeah.
Sir Joshua didn't have access to the British Prime Minister. He never met a British Prime Minister until the dockyard closure, when we had meetings with Margaret Thatcher. The Foreign Office, Sir Joshua never had any meetings with the Foreign Secretary. And that made life very difficult for him.
Were they just not interested?
Only when Wilson came here to use Gibraltar for the Rhodesia negotiation.
But then he was dealing with Rhodesia. He wasn't interested in the future, particularly in the future of Gibraltar. What Sir Joshua did have was a lot of clout in the House of Commons. There you could see the standing that he had and how ordinary members of Parliament held him in a very, very high regard. So he had standing in the UK, but we always had great difficulties in dealing with Number 10 and with the British Foreign Office. On his deathbed, he said to Francis Cantos, "I wish I had quarrelled more often with the Foreign Office." Those were practically his last words.
That's not a wish that you or Joe, Peter, will ever
We
have
never.
had to,
It's never a wish that went without satisfaction.
I made up for it after.
And look where we are now. We negotiate directly, not just with British ministers, but with Spanish ministers. We speak for ourselves in international.
Yeah.
I mean, it's undeniable
it'd
that
be
this community.
interesting.
To answer your first question, the journey over 50 years. I mean, is frankly a textbook.
Well, let's talk
case
first of
study
all,
about
trying
how
to go
to
in
progress.
along the timeline. We then had the '67 referendum, and that enraged Spain and ended up with the frontier closed, and that was another trend.
I think it's important because it's a point that's been made before. Let's not, especially when we're talking about 1967, let's not talk about Spain. Let's talk about a dictator who was a fascist, who was not used to being told no, especially by people in the Iberian Peninsula, because there was a lot of suffering in Spain then as a result of what that man in Madrid was doing. It wasn't just the Gibraltarians who suffered. This enraged Franco, right? And that really led to the sacrifices that had to be made here, because he made the decision to close the frontier and see Gibraltar fall like a mature fruit. The pity is that, unfortunately, too many people in the wider Spain, even today, buy into the narrative of that man.
Yeah. And of course, he contributed hugely to our subsequent success, to our subsequent political success, to our subsequent economic success, to our ability to govern ourselves, to our cutting of our political teeth. I wonder how Gibraltar would be different today if some of the things we've been discussing here this evening had not happened.
The things we're discussing this evening have made his grave a rotisserie.
It's interesting, actually. Yes, Sir Joe, you were saying that it was the hostility from Spain that prompted Gibraltar to, look at self-sufficiency.
Not necessarily Gibraltar. I think, you see, we were disconnected from the rest. I mean, our relationship... We're the closest colony that the United Kingdom had. Everything that the UK exported to the empire reached Gibraltar first. The Chronicle is the first daily after the Times. The RGP is the first one after. So we were closer already in many respects, right? But of course, there was still, from the beginning, the British, and the bulk of the British meant the people from UK. The settlers from UK were the British content, right? And then there were the Genoese and all the others, right? But what we created, I think, is out of that element of people from different parts of Europe, mainly from the Mediterranean, coming here, a sense of identity, like the people that migrated to the North Americas, now see themselves as Americans. They may be Italian North Americans or Latin North Americans, but they are Americans. They are no longer, they see themselves as the different people.
Yeah.
And we created a people, and I think one of the characteristics is that one generation is enough. In Gibraltar, one generation is sufficient for that child as an adult to say, I'm a Gibraltarian.
To integrate.
Yeah. And that's a very powerful thing, because in other places, they move from one place to the other and they keep their sense of identity of where they came from for a very long time.
Yeah.
Distinct, yeah.
Can we talk about, you mentioned integration. Let's talk about the integration movement. Okay. Why did that come about? It eventually died a death, didn't it?
Look, I'm not a political historian. There are people better qualified to comment on that. My sense is that it was a defensive reaction to what people thought that was a safer place to be in the face of the threat from Spain on sovereignty. And I think history has shown that was not the case, that we were always much better off fighting our corner as a people in a UN-listed territory with the right to self-determination, with the UK being unable in international law to do certain things against our wishes.
Yes, but
Joe was a candidate.
Yeah,
I know.
You set up the integration list.
I know he was.
I actually started it.
Yes,
Yeah.
with Fascio, no?
Yes, and we started
Did you really believe that was the...
Well, no. What we did first was we set up a group to investigate, and we contacted the Maltese, because Don Mintoff had been negotiating integration for Malta.
And Harold Wilson refused it to it.
No, he finally refused, because being Maltese, the condition that he put to the UK was that they would pay for all the social services in Malta, but the Maltese would keep all the taxes, right? Because it was Maltese. That's because
Maltese.
You will know.
But ultimately, Britain wasn't interested, were they?
But you see,
in Gibraltar integrating.
But when we looked at what happened there, and we looked at what was being said in the United Nations, and we look at the fact that at the time, the AACR was talking about close association with the UK. That didn't exist. There were three options, and it was not close. It was free.
Free.
So free association meant that the UK could say goodbye to us at any time they wanted.
That was the danger,
Right.
yeah.
So we opposed the three options. I came out against what Joshua and Isola did in the UN. I think I was the only one in Gibraltar at the time when everybody was waving flags. But the reality is that we were already in a situation of virtually total economic integration. If you looked at the economy of Gibraltar when it was closed, right, 99% of our income came from defense expenditure. And 99% of our expenditure went into the UK. We bought bricks from the London Brick Company. We brought water from Northumbria in tankers, right? So the interchange of trade, one way and the other, was almost as if we were a little far away from Southend.
Yeah.
So we had that economic integration into which we were trapped. And we had a situation which was what had to be broken first. So the parity had political consequences and not just a huge increase in the welfare of our people. But,
well, explain why that is.
well, because you see, there was a study. I've always believed that the battle for parity was as hard and as long as it was because there was already a plan in the UK to hand us over to Spain.
Right. So,
Okay.
like the Lisbon,
There was a study done which was financed 50-50 by when there was the guy that was in the ambassador in London.
Cartier, no? Cartier?
He became Foreign Secretary of Spain at the day.
Yes, yeah.
And he promoted this, and it was done by a non-profit making sort of entity in the UK and Spain. And this joint study, which was published in 1967, actually analyzed how what had to happen for us to be integrated into Spain, right? And the first thing that had to happen was that economically, you couldn't have an economy in Gibraltar which was much, much higher than the economy in Spain. So there had to be economic integration for there to be a possibility of political integration.
Parity
took us in the opposite direction.
Okay, but can I just ask you a question, though?
Because it would have been cheaper for the MOD to agree it in the first year than to fight.
Do you agree that with, sorry Ross, do you agree that with integration,
Yeah.
we would not have had the degree of political self-government, we would not have had the legislative independence to set up our own tax system, we could not have developed, you could not have started post-dockyard economy,
I agree entirely.
and we would not today be enjoying the socio-economic standard of living that we enjoy.
But the fight for the integration, right, was not on the basis that all those things were alternatives. Integration was one of three options. We were talking about decolonization.
Yeah.
We were talking about what the United Nations was telling us. In UK, the argument of the UK, of the officials, because this was being driven by the officials, not by the political class. The officials were saying, we are one of the people who created the United Nations. It was created by Roosevelt and Churchill. So we created this organization. How can we be in a position which is very embarrassing, being criticized every year by the United Nations?
Well,
as long as it's a fascist regime, okay.
We will
when there isn't one?
We will talk about the United Nations.
But
later,
isn't
but
the fascinating thing that the guy who started the integration movement is the guy who then de facto delivered the autonomy
yeah.
between 88 and
That's
96?
what.
Well, I'm
so
delighted
that's
that
why
Joe
I asked-
abandoned
So, Joe, that's why I asked whether you truly believed in the
I
cause.
always took
We
the
would not
point of
be
view of
where
the
we are today.
ACR.
No, because you see, I think what
Sorry,
we'll come to you
you see,
now.
I think something that is very pertinent to what is happening now, right, is that at any point in time, you have to look at what the options are at that time, because that is when the decision is being made.
I think,
with the benefit of hindsight, you can say, well, look,
Yes,
maybe
exactly.
we shouldn't have
Mr.
gone that
Canepa.
way.
I agree with Peter. I think basically integration was born out of fear. Fear of take over by Spain.
Absolutely.
If we were integrated with Britain, then Spain would have to drop her claim to Gibraltar, which was totally unrealistic.
Or attack would be a part of the...
Or in the other direction, look at the case in Northern Ireland, right? Very different situation, violence, terrorism, etc. But because Northern Ireland was part of the United Kingdom, the United Kingdom government was able to do, for example, the Northern Ireland Agreement, which a lot of people in Northern Ireland have never liked.
With no referendum in Northern Ireland.
With no referendum, with no voice, no choice. And they could have done that to Gibraltar as part of the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom government can deal with us as they deal with Kent if they wanted to.
There's no question about
They
that.
can't do that to Gibraltar.
Brexit was bad enough without being integrated. Just imagine being integrated.
But let me just ask you, gentlemen, if I might just ask you...
I think, look, Hattersley came here to kill integration.
Yes,
right?
and he did.
Yeah.
He did.
Well, I'm very grateful.
Yes.
So, what you've just said is true, of course. But at the time that he came to kill it, the options were not what you're doing. What you're saying now.
I agree with that.
The option was that we have to kill this because we want to have talks with Spain.
Exactly.
Okay.
They killed it for the wrong reasons. We delivered a better result.
Okay, let me just ask a question. I'm really dying to ask this question because obviously Britain has its military base here, and you spoke about plans to hand Gibraltar over to Spain, but surely it would never have gone that far because of the bases that they had
But
here.
they have bases in Akrotiri, in
Yes, but
Cyprus,
we're at the entrance
etc.
to the Mediterranean.
And Cyprus is at the other end. The base, in that world that we're talking about, the base and the people are two distinct things, and you can hand over the rest of Gibraltar and the people and keep the base.
Jack Straw's joint sovereignty plan envisaged.
Whilst now,
we are all right, our base is okay,
That's
and
right.
for the rest of it...
whilst now, and in particular...
The Cypriot is not in Cyprus,
Exactly.
it's British.
Exactly.
It's a British territory.
That's right.
But now I would ask people in Gibraltar to look at this in a slightly different way, especially post-1981 and the British Nationality Act. It's not that Britain has a base in Gibraltar. It's that we, who are British too, have a base here, and this is part of Britain in that context, in the defence context. This is not an alien base that there is here.
And it's true to say, at least it was during all my years as Chief Minister, and I'm sure it's been the same for everybody else around this table, in the worst times of our relationship with Britain, in terms of what they're up to, Brussels, etc., the MOD, the Ministry of Defence have always been Gibraltar's strongest ally in Whitehall.
No question about
And
that.
at the time of the joint sovereignty, I always felt the MOD at Secretary of State level,
Always on our side.
always watching our backs.
Even in this negotiation. To such an extent, even historically, that they persuaded Joe Bossano. They didn't really have to persuade him in 1982 to lift industrial action to turn the Uganda into a hospital ship for the Falklands.
Right,
Yeah. Well, let's talk about what actually eventually led to the joint sovereignty talks, possibly the bilateral talks that began. You had the Lisbon Agreement, trying to normalise relationships between the UK and Spain. How aware were we that those talks were going on?
Lisbon, no. I remember the evening when Peter Isola and Sir Joshua appeared on television when the Lisbon Declaration was made public.
Yeah.
I'll never forget the expressions on their faces.
Two ghosts.
They really felt soul down the river. And then it became clear that it wasn't just a question of sovereignty. It was sovereignties,
Yeah.
you know?
The plural.
Plural.
Yeah.
It was a very, very hard blow. Oddly enough, I understand that when Marcelino Oreja, who negotiated it with Carrington, went back to Madrid, the Spanish cabinet did not support him. And shortly afterwards, he was dropped from the government, and Pérez Llorca came in. And then time went by, and by 1982, they were ready. We were ready that weekend of the Falklands invasion. Sir Joshua, Jackson, Peter Isola and I were ready to go to Sintra for talks. And then the Argentinians invaded the Falklands, and everything fell through. And after that, there wasn't any more progress until Brussels in November '84.
Sir Peter.
And I think it has always been so. And it was just a continuation of what Joe was saying before, when he, by reference to Hattersley. There has always been a school of thought, a file that gets dusted down with every new incoming chief minister to try it on again. I don't think it's true anymore, because, as Fabian keeps on saying to me, the mindset in the Foreign Office has changed, the kind of people that populate the Foreign Office has changed. It's a much more modern place. But certainly in our days, and I think in your days, there was a school of thought that said, here is the master plan for Gibraltar. It involved doing a little with Spain.
Yeah.
And they deployed it in Lisbon, in Brussels. Yeah. Most recently, at the time of the joint sovereignty negotiations, and Gibraltar has always had to be vigilant and rely on its friends in London. But there's always been. I think that those days are finished. I think that those days are finished. Hopefully, Brussels is now condemned to the dustbins of history. I think the government of Gibraltar now speaks for itself, negotiates for itself. The double lock. These negotiations have demonstrated that the UK will not do things unless the Gibraltar government agrees. And I think that Gibraltar is safe now, as safe as we can be, or we've ever been, from those dynamics.
I think the point that Adolfo makes is an important one that we must never lose sight of when we look at our history. Spain has actually done us a number of favours, as Joe suggests. I think Franco did us a favour in '67, etc. But even in joint sovereignty, Aznar did us a favour by telling Piqué that he was not satisfied with what Blair and Straw were putting on the table. The example Adolfo gave about the Spanish Foreign Minister not having the support of the Spanish cabinet at the time. Luckily, Spain's overwhelming ambition has enabled us to tip them over in certain difficult moments and to continue down the road that has got us to here. And I do worry, Ross, that you're almost addressing this as if we'd reached the street and this was the end. This is not by any means
Oh, we haven't got there yet, don't worry.
This is only the beginning of a new and potentially very exciting chapter.
Absolutely, and we'll talk about that afterwards. So, Joe, Mr. Canepa, you, after the airport agreement, things didn't work out for the AACR.
Yeah.
We'll come to you in a moment, but just tell us about that.
We never saw in the Brussels agreement the dangers that became immediately evident with the airport agreement is what really brought home to us the dangers. On the Sunday before we travelled to London, where we were not involved in the negotiation, it was Howe and Ordóñez. On that Sunday, for the first time ever, ministers met in Sir Joshua's house, I remember. And some of the ministers that were less hawkish, the late Brian Perez, the late Reggie Valerino, they weren't as hawkish as people like Delipiani, Samit, myself. And Brian Perez said to Sir Joshua, we cannot support this agreement, Sir Joshua. So we went to London that Wednesday, and Sir Joshua knew perfectly well that ministers could not support. But he wasn't at the time either very keen on it. He told Howe more than once, I cannot deliver this. So he didn't think that he could deliver. But the mistake that he made, unfortunately, was he didn't disassociate himself from the airport agreement. And we saw the dangers threat to sovereignty. And that is why when we went into opposition, remember, Joe, we broke from the Brussels agreement. We were able, I think, to bury it once and for all.
Well, Sir Joe, you're a very different character, if I might say, to Sir Joshua Hassan. I think you were seen as a little bit of a rebel-rouser in the UK, a bit of a troublemaker.
It's a very gentle way to put it.
Bolshevik is probably the nicest thing anybody's ever called me.
But were you not concerned about... were you not concerned about...
Easygoing sort of guy?
Were you not concerned about upsetting them too much?
Look, I mean, if taking it up from where Adolfo had, that was a betrayal of the UK and the EU. I mean,
a betrayal by or of?
No, a betrayal by both of them.
Yeah.
Because in fact, the bad thing about the Brussels agreement was that everybody expected when Joshua first was saying the value of entering the European Union and that there would be a future where Europeans would not be fighting each other, and therefore in that future we would be neighbors with Spain and so on. All that was an expectation that the time would come when the integration of Spain into democratic Europe would mean a different kind of relationship, right? And the expectation was that if we were members with UK, then the UK and the EU would put the condition on Spain that they had to remove the restrictions. The first betrayal was that we gave them EU rights in Gibraltar 11 months before they gave it to anywhere else. You know, we were dead against that. We said to the UK, if you want to give them 11 months of EU rights, why don't you give it to them in UK? Why here? Right? So they were given a special access so that they had an excuse to say, well, we are not doing it because we have done something wrong and we put it right. We're doing it because you are giving concessions to get us to lift restrictions, right? I always argued, if Franco started the blockade by saying, after the UN, if you want to continue to have the relationship of fluidity and access to Spain, then you have to start talking with Spain about charity, about
sovereignty.
Sovereignty. And the fact that they sign an agreement in Brussels 11 months before they join to legitimize their entry into the EU, and on top of that, saying we are going to talk about the issues of sovereignty. Well, look, Franco won. You can argue, as an outsider looking at that, he won. He put the blockade. He removed the blockade. On removal, he got what he had asked for when it started. Right?
But to bring this review of history and to make it meaningful to the younger generation of Gibraltarian, today, as a result of all the stands that Gibraltar has made over all of these issues, it is inconceivable, it is impossible for the United Kingdom to contemplate even a conversation about sovereignty, let alone a deal about sovereignty, without the Gibraltar people and government being by its side as they do.
I have to add a strand to that.
That's right.
Because I think you're absolutely right. But I think it's not just the United Kingdom that can no longer countenance that. I think Spain too can no longer countenance that. And I think that is our achievement.
And this is where we have got, from where we were to where we are today, is a position
It's a fight that we won.
Of unimpeachable, I think, political security based and achieved in no small measure because of our economic potency over the decade. This is the importance. This is one of the things that Joe taught me when I first arrived in politics, that you can't have political security without economic prosperity.
But it's
either
not
you
just
pay
that.
your way in the world or you're somebody else's
But it's not just that. You have to be able to pay your way.
Absolutely.
You have to be able to pay your way, but you have to be able to make your argument as well. You can't have one without the other. And I still remember, it's one of my first memories, I still remember the cogency with which Joe argued the link between Strasbourg and Lisbon and the UN resolutions and then Brussels, and how that centered my political thinking in the late 1980s when I was a schoolboy. And my first political act, which was to come out, all of us were probably there, in 1987, against the airport agreement, which was 15,000 people on the streets, led by Joe and Sir Joshua, who came back
reluctantly,
perhaps, but we were all there, and in those days, a British official would come out on the balcony of the convent, Mr. Ratford, I think was his name from memory, Neil Ratford, to listen to what the local people were saying. That would never happen now.
You have to have a strong government that is able to serve the full term of 4 years because they have a working majority. Yeah. If you didn't, if you had a government that would be vacillating, weak, we would be in serious trouble.
I'm going to move it on to the joint sovereignty because despite the opposition to the airport agreement...
I think the important thing for our people is that when the chips are down and when there is something that is a threat to all of us, then we should forget that we're in different political parties.
Yeah. And that has happened.
I'll always
happened.
remember what Joe Bossano standing up in Parliament. I was there already, saying to Peter Caruana, and never the twain really met between these two when they were in Parliament, let them know that before they get to you, they have to get through me. Yeah, which was a very powerful demonstration of that.
Yeah. OK, so let's get to. I'm trying to move along a timeline here because joint sovereignty came about despite the opposition to the airport agreement. So it was very clear where Gibraltarians stood on sovereignty, but they still went behind our backs and started talking about it.
It's a combination of the same things that we've been talking about.
Yeah.
The determination of the people of Gibraltar to fight a common enemy together. Our political ability to do so, our economic ability to do so, calling on our friends in the UK.
The importance of the economy is that, you know, I mean, if you look at where we were when we were totally dependent in the MOD and development aid, right? And suppose that had not changed, how long would it have been before somebody said, well, look, what is Gibraltar costing us?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you know,
And they closed the dockyard. So, yeah.
Yes. So, I mean, joint sovereignty, I mean, the British government says that because they never understood it as we did in terms of abandoning our principles. They thought of it as, for them, the deal is we will never do it unless the people of Gibraltar support it. But by saying that it was the only option that we had, they were in effect denying our right to self-determination. This is what I could never get Jack Straw to understand. Jack, don't you understand that this is not about... we know that you're not going to give us away without a referendum vote. He said that in Parliament. But what you have done is told the world that we do not have the right... That is the only choice, that we don't have the right to... You have betrayed our right to self-determination as a people. What no UK government has ever been willing to do at the United Nations.
And the Spanish would then say, now it's just a question of when, which is what they used to say about Brussels. Ya está encarrilado en el proceso de Bruselas. It would have become the same on joint sovereignty. But I'll always remember about joint sovereignty. I was carrying Joe's bag to the United Nations that year, and coming out of the United Nations was Emma Jones-Parry.
Oh, yeah.
And as usual, Joe has a very good relationship with people who he doesn't agree with. So Parry puts his arm around Joe and says, Joe, how are you? He said, Emmy, what on earth are you doing in joint sovereignty? I don't think you put it in quite those terms. And Emma Parry-Jones, we're after the watershed, so I'm going to say exactly what he said. Said to Joe, I finally found a minister with the balls to do what needs to be done in Gibraltar.
Yeah.
Right? And he said, well, good luck with getting it done because we're going to stop it.
OK, I'm going to ask a question, Sir Peter. Jack Straw later defended his position.
When he came here.
As well, yeah.
Jack Straw later defended his position in his biography, saying that he felt...
Peter
Jack Straw as well. And he defended his decision to explore talks. In light of how relations have developed over the decades that have led to the treaty agreement, do you, in hindsight, think, well, it's OK to explore talks?
No, not on sovereignty. The only people that we can talk to about our sovereignty are our sovereign. That's it. And that argument has finally got through to the United Kingdom and to Spain.
And that's the double lock.
Yeah.
That's
the double lock. I mean, if somebody were to say to me, in your 16 years in office, what do you most celebrate having achieved for myself? The double lock, which was given by Jeff Hoon, and because that meant what Fabian has just said, that they had accepted that they could not even discuss sovereignty.
That's right.
Never mind do a deal about it, not even sit in a table.
In that respect, we are as independent as anybody can be.
Our sovereignty, in my view, our sovereignty is no longer on the table.
To put it in terms of the debate in the last 3 weeks, that trigger is only in Gibraltarian hands.
Right, and that was the end of bilateralism, joint sovereignty.
I mean, I think the Brussels Agreement still technically exists, but I don't think it functions. And the idea...
Well, no. I mean,
the motion in the UN no longer talks about it.
It no longer...
the spirit of it.
By spirit. And that was Jeff Hoon too.
But let's be
that
very
was
clear.
the same speech in which he said words which subsequently became the double lock.
Where is Brussels today? We've got to see where it ends up.
Capital of Belgium.
But remember that the timeline is important. Brussels was only about Spain coming into the European Union and us being members of the same club. We are no longer members of the same club. right? So the raison d'etre of Brussels
no longer
is gone,
exists,
yeah? And that's very important to keep in mind as
But
well.
Brussels or not, it's the fact that the government of Gibraltar, as the elected representatives of the people of Gibraltar, are now recognised by the UK government as the only party government legitimised to commit the people of Gibraltar and the territory of Gibraltar to something. And the UK, they have the legal power to do so, of course. They have the treaty-making power to do so. Parliament is sovereign. And of course they have the right to do it. The important thing is that they wouldn't. They no longer feel free, morally entitled to it.
Although, can I caveat that too? Because there is a question now of whether or not they would have the power to do that, because Gibraltarians have human rights too. And simply discarding the choice of the people of Gibraltar because we are the people of a non-self-governing territory and we're listed in the UN, we are distinct, we're British but distinct. There is a question of whether even Parliament is supreme enough to do these things and might not be injuncted by a British court from being able to take a step such
And the
as that.
Chagos case
is very helpful in
very
that sense. It's very helpful in that sense.
Well, I'd like to talk about the UN in part 2, but for now, I want to move on to. First of all, can I just say, are you aware of? You must be aware, obviously, by now, and having spoken to Peter Hain, but he said in his biography that they came very, very close to striking a deal. So I'm just trying to get a bit of sense of history here. How you got a sense of all of that?
The deal that they did strike a deal.
They did actually strike.
They did
They
strike a
agreed
deal.
it,
The
did they?
deal was to launch what subsequently happened in the joint sovereignty
Right.
proposal that Jack Straw. They did do it.
Okay.
But the fascinating thing about
Yeah.
what Haynes says, and in fact, if I may say so,
Yeah.
the disreputable thing about
It
what
would
stay
Haynes says,
there
Yeah.
exactly.
until we were ready for it.
The disreputable thing about what Haynes says, in my view, right, is that he says it wasn't derailed because of a small matter of a referendum in Gibraltar, which is definitely what derailed it. It was derailed because Aznar said to Piqué, it's not enough, I don't want joint sovereignty, I want it all, this is too long.
They can save face as they want.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But
So
for
the people of
for a
Gibraltar
human rights
defeated that.
campaigner like Peter Hain to say that it's not the referendum that stops it, it's the Spanish not wanting to do the deal, shows you the mindset that the Labour Party had got itself in that part of the early part of this century, that they could do these things because of a war in Iraq.
It's the referendum. It's the British government underestimating the strength of Gibraltar's support in Parliament.
Yeah.
They would never have got it through Parliament.
That's true.
I mean, I remember we took, I don't know if you remember, but because we could afford it.
The adverts,
the economic,
absolutely.
we spent a fortune
Yeah.
with full paid advertisement.
Yeah.
And the post office used to complain, when are you going to stop your campaign? Because they had to deliver a general post office van every day to Gibraltar House to deliver the mail bags of support, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of letters from factory floors. People saying, this is only one letter, but everybody in the factory floor have stolen support. They completely miscalculated the effect that their treachery, frankly, would have on British public opinion, and did have on
The only
British
person who I think understood it was Jack Straw, no? Who said to us at a Labour Party conference once, people didn't understand like I understood, that if this went well, it didn't matter in the United Kingdom. But if it went badly, it was going to go very badly for me as Foreign Secretary, and which in the end it did, because he and Hain became the object of ire in the United Kingdom.
It's interesting how Gibraltar's relationship with the Labour
Wasn't there a
Party.
problem also about the military with the Spaniards?
Yes, well, it's not a problem with the military.
No. In
Part
terms
of the
reaching
design,
the agreement, I mean.
Part of the design was that the UK would keep their base.
keep it.
And there was then born, I think this is something Fabian has indirectly alluded to it, there was then born an opposition voice within Spain at the idea of having a
base.
continuing British base, and the British said, well, that's the red line.
So that's what killed it then.
Well, it's not what killed it. No, what killed
Well, the
it is what we have
referendum.
said.
Definitely.
Yeah, the referendum.
The referendum,
Yeah.
our support in Parliament, and public opinion that was mobilised
It was killed on both
in
sides. though.
support of Gibraltar.
Okay, I wanted to ask very quickly before we move on to the Trilateral Forum, which emerged several years afterwards, and I'd like to know how that relationship developed. But just very quickly, just comment on the relationship that Gibraltar's had with the Labour Party in the UK. It seems to have, over the years, had a stronger relationship with the socialists in Spain than the socialists in the UK. I mean, perhaps not so much now, but certainly in the past. And it's quite interesting why that is.
Well, I work very well with a Conservative government in the United Kingdom. David Cameron used to say to Joseph and to me, Gibraltar is the gift that keeps on giving for the Conservative Party. It's instinctive for us. My party gets it. Of course, it is the party that bequeathed us Brussels and bequeathed us the airport agreement, so they're not entirely without blame in all of this. But I think at that time really driven more by officials than the instinct. And Labour has had a checkered history with colonies and its colonial past. I think the way that the United Kingdom has changed and politics has changed in the United Kingdom has also changed the Labour Party. It's no longer the Guardian-style approach that all colonies are bad, let's get rid of them because they are a vestige of the past, although the Guardian still has this idea that things that go on overseas territories are entirely embarrassing and we should be disassociating ourselves with them. But the Labour Party is in a different place. The Labour Party is in a place of understanding, perhaps because it's led by a human rights lawyer, that the people in Gibraltar have rights and that those rights have to be respected. And they've encapsulated that in the phrase that you will have heard a lot of, which is nothing about Gibraltar without Gibraltar. And that's what we inherited when we moved from a Conservative Party that gave us the vote in the Brexit referendum, that ensured that we were represented at the top table in the negotiation, and then seamlessly into this new style Labour Party with none of what one might call the swagger and the arrogance of Tony Blair's modern-looking but actually not so modern-behaving Labour Party in relation to Gibraltar. And that served us very well indeed now. And for the first time in history, you have this red road from London through Madrid to Gibraltar, where you have socialist parties everywhere. And I think that has helped us in the negotiation of the treaty, because if we had had a Spanish Conservative government, things might be a little different. So in London, a Conservative government or a Labour government have served us well, at least in the time I've been in office. In Madrid, it's only been when we've seen the change from a Conservative government to a socialist government that we've been able to get traction.
And perhaps that started with the Trilateral Forum, Sir Peter.
Well, the forerunner of the Trilateral Forum was the two flags, three voices, which never got off the ground. But that was with a Conservative government, with a Conservative part, with a Pepe government in Spain. And I came very close. We had already decided the communique that we would issue after the talks on with a chap called Bastarreche, who was then the chap responsible in Madrid, and it all came a cropper because there was a leak to Antena 3 in Spain, and Abascal, who was then the newsreader, the father of the present Voxman, made a comment. I hear that our illustrious foreign minister is planning to meet with the chief minister of Gibraltar.
Carrascal.
Carrascal.
Unrelated.
Unrelated. You're absolutely right. And it all came an absolute cropper. I got a phone call the next day, say, it's been made impossible for us, and it was all called off. The venue had been decided, the agenda had been decided, and then the Trilateral Forum was really the. As so often happens, when you stand up for your rights and you win, they then try to
get more,
give you some sort of compensation, and the Trilateral Forum was able to be established. Really, to pick up the same thing that Fabian has just developed of political ideologies in Spain, because there was a very bold foreign minister in Spain called Miguel Ángel Moratinos, who was willing to invest the political capital required to facilitate what became a process in which, by the terms of the Chevening Agreement that we negotiated to establish it, each of the three parties spoke for themselves with a separate voice represented by their own government. Really, the beginning of the end of. Everyone's contributed to that process, not least my predecessors in their stand against the Brussels process. So everyone has contributed to where we are now, which is bilateralism is no longer something that Gibraltar needs to fear.
I think there's an important point there which I omitted to make when I was doing my analysis on broadly ideological terms, which is this, that it's not just about the ideological colour of the government in Madrid, it's also about the nature of the Foreign Secretary. Because I had a terrible time with Margallo, but actually Alfonso Dastis is a gentleman, Partido Popular, a lifelong diplomat, already things started to become possible.
Borrell, no?
But no, Borrell was socialist. But Alfonso Dastis was Partido Popular foreign secretary. And we were able to start the process of talking to him after Brexit, despite the fact that he was Partido Popular, again, because of in fact, a fortuitous meeting that I had with him just opposite Gibraltar House. I was walking back from dinner, not having taken the car. He was staying at the ME Hotel. He was outside on his phone. I saw him, I recognized him, I started to talk to him, he started to talk to me. It was just after the referendum in Catalonia, the illegal referendum in Catalonia, and he was doing interviews for the Financial Times and the Economist in London. And I said, Alfonso, hablando se entiende la gente, vamos a hablar. Y me dijo, muy buena idea, vamos a intentarlo. And from there, actually, even before Josep Borrell arrived in the Foreign Office in Spain, we had started to talk. But ironically, Josep Borrell had been in Gibraltar 2 years before, retired from politics, thinking that he was never going to go back into government, and visited my office with Mal del Sur, who organized for him to come. And he said to me, Fabian, estoy encantado de estar aquí. Yo creí que Gibraltar era solamente una base militar llena de soldados.
Yeah.
And that man was about to become Foreign Secretary of Spain.
Yeah.
Weren't we lucky that he actually saw Gibraltar and then understood Gibraltar, because he didn't just become Foreign Secretary of Spain and we started the process of talking then about the withdrawal agreement. He then went on to become the Foreign Minister of the whole of the European Union with a better understanding of what Gibraltar is.
Well, there's still plenty more to discuss after the break. We're going to talk about the Cordoba Agreement. We're also going to talk about the rise of Fabian Picardo and the challenges that he's had as well, the development of those relationships. We've got Brexit as well, and also the treaty. We're also going to be looking at domestic politics and what it's been like in the office of number 6, what it takes to be a chief minister, what the future is, not only for politics in Gibraltar, but also beyond a treaty. All that still to come in part 2. Stay with me. Hello and welcome back to a very special edition of Viewpoint. I have Gibraltar's 4 chief ministers with me. We have Sir Joe Bossano, Fabian Picardo, Adolfo Canepa and Sir Peter Caruana. Sir Peter Caruana is slightly concerned that everyone's going to be falling asleep, so we'll have to have some rows, I think, on the panel tonight.
You told me the programme is 2 hours long.
I do actually foresee 1 or 2 that might be coming up, because we're going to talk about the Cordoba Agreement now, which was your baby, Sir Peter, but it didn't quite get off as to
I think you've got to start at the beginning. The Cordoba Agreements were the fruit of the trilateral process, not to be confused. The trilateral process is one thing. When it was got going, it resulted in the Cordoba Agreements. The Cordoba Agreements, I'll come to the trilateral process, but whilst you're on the Cordoba Agreements, it's got to be understood that unlike the current agreement, which is a treaty and therefore law and therefore legally binding, the Cordoba Agreements were not. They were political agreements. They were not in any sense legally binding, etc. But the Trilateral Forum, we've already hinted about what I think the importance of it were. And we can come in a moment if you want to discuss the Cordoba Agreements themselves, the fruits of Trilateral and what happened to those. But the Trilateral Forum was a forum in which for the first time Spain agreed to speak directly to Gibraltar in a process which it signed up to include the statement that each of the 3 places would speak for themselves, and furthermore agreed that if anything were to be agreed that would require a treaty, given that Gibraltar did not have international treaty-making powers, the UK would make it, but Spain signed up to the fact that the United Kingdom would not agree to anything, to any treaty in relation to Gibraltar, without the agreement of the government of Gibraltar. It was, in a sense, the other night I referred to it as condemning Brussels. It was the first time that Spain, at least, had signed up to a process which recognised that Gibraltar were valid interlocutors, that the UK were not valid interlocutors for Gibraltar, a necessary party. We wouldn't want to be in process of dialogue without the UK, but that there was no way forward on any issue affecting Gibraltar without Gibraltar present as a separate party, speaking with its own voice and with that security. That then led, and all of that was only possible because there was a government in Spain with a Foreign Secretary, Miguel Ángel Moratinos, who had the political courage to sign up to that and to deliver that.
And come to Gibraltar.
Sorry?
And
then later come to Gibraltar. And then that resulted in a lot of negotiations about pensions, about the airport, about telephone numbers, about a whole stack of things, which were struck in Córdoba between the three parties, Jeff Hoon for the UK, Miguel Ángel Moratinos and myself for Gibraltar. One of those was that version of the airport agreement, but not an airport agreement in a political sense, not in a legal sense. And that, ironically, came a cropper before the Pepe came out. When the Spanish government realized, the socialist government realized that it was going to lose the election to Spain, it paid too much heed to the views of the incoming government, or what would be the incoming government, the PP, who said they would not support the airport agreement. And ironically, it was the then socialist PSOE foreign minister, Trinidad Jiménez, who said to me, we're not going to go through with this political agreement. There's no point. Our successors are not going to accept it. And sculpted. But the other things were left. The pension problems was resolved with not with Gibraltar money. Telephone numbers were resolved. A whole stack of things were solved.
Yeah. So then Fabian Picardo became chief minister, and you weren't very keen on the Córdoba agreement, or at least not all aspects of it.
So we had been very clear in the analysis that was done of the Córdoba agreements. That was Joe, who was leader of the opposition, with Joseph leading the Liberal Party. We took some time. We took a week or so to react. In fact, the most critical voice in relation to the Córdoba agreement and the quickest of the mark was the now leader of the GSD, Keith, when he was leading the PDP. But
don't be mischievous. You've been on your best behaviour so far.
There is an important point in relation to what Peter did in relation to the Córdoba agreement, which we must put on the table. Those agreements were done in 2006. Peter went on to win a general election in 2007. So our position was that people had accepted the Córdoba agreement in Gibraltar because it had been a live issue in the general election. I still remember the leaders' debate, not here, but at South Barrack Road, with both of these gentlemen at the leaders' debate. And that was the argument about cherry-picking in 2007. Remember? That was the cherry-picking election, if we were to call it that.
Some of it, but not all of it.
That's right. Yeah. And so our position going into government in 2011 was to say, look, most of the Córdoba things had been done. Performance was already there on pensions, on phone numbers, etc. The key thing was the airport. My big beef in that general election was that the airport was being built before we were doing the schools and the mental hospital that we needed, etc., etc. Peter always reminds me, I used to go around in that general election with an old Gibraltar Chronicle where he had said it was going to cost 20 million, it ended up costing 80 million. But look, if it hadn't been done, we wouldn't have been able to do these arrangements. So this is why we all build on things. But our position going into the general election in 2011 was to say, if Spain performs, we will perform. We think that there are bits that need to be negotiated better, and if there's an opportunity, we will seek to do that. But I think it's important to remember that we're dealing with maybe 10 folios of paper, as Peter says, a political agreement. There was the ability there to change those things. Today, we're talking about a completely different beast. We're talking about 1,018 legal pages of text. So we were prepared to do this. No sooner had we won the election, I think the same weekend that we had won the election, Mariano Rajoy, who had become president of Spain 2 or 3 weeks earlier, announces that a gentleman by the name of José Manuel García Margallo is going to become foreign minister. And his first words in Brussels to Charles Tannock, who was a MEP, was "he will hablar español."
Yeah.
And his next
was
one
it.
was "the party's over" or something like that.
Se acabó el recreo. Se acabó el recreo.
Se acabó el recreo.
Yeah.
That's right.
I'd like to rewind a little bit, though, because we're talking about relations and developing relations. So let's rewind a little bit to the relationship with the UK under the first GSLP era. So, Joe, you fought very robustly for Gibraltar's rights and for Gibraltar's right to, to be self-sufficient, and that meant getting income where income could come. That meant we had the rise of the sort of the fast launch era, and that did damage the relationship with Britain. Were you aware? I mean, how did you balance that?
When we first came into government, they thought they could persuade me to support the Brussels Agreement. I don't know why they should think that, but we had demonstrations against it, commitment against it, and the next thing was that the money that was there for the Spanish pensioners. I mean, I think the people in La Linea should build a statue in commemoration of you, because you got the UK government to dish out 200 million quid to pay their pensions. They expected us to pay when I came in, right? And they said, I remember that they said, look, Sir Joshua had put on the table £1 million, and £1 million is not enough. So we need to talk about this, because this is serious. It's going to cost a lot of money, and we cannot pay that, and we have to see how you pay it. And I said, well, the £1 million is no longer there. I've just come from an election that says not one penny. Okay, so the answer is not one penny. And the money had run out before they had given something like 7 million over 3 years, and it didn't last for the 3 years. So the money was going to be running out in the summer, and we had been elected in March, right? And they said to me, well, we're not paying. So, there will be no pensions in La Linea, and there's going to be riots in La Linea if you don't put the money. And I said, and there will be riots in Gibraltar if I do. I don't like riots, but if I'm going to have it, I prefer that in La Linea and not in Gibraltar. And that was one of the first meetings, So that was a kind of tone of friendly relationship that we had.
Yeah.
So they tried to make me go in a direction which went directly against everything. It's incredible, no? Because they say they believe in democracy. And I said, look, well, I've just been to an election and you want me to betray everything that I have said I'm going to do. And I said, if you prove to me that I've been wrong in all my analysis, and that what I want to do is bad for Gibraltar, and what you want me to do is good for Gibraltar, that's all you need to do.
But would you, when you look back now, would you do anything differently? I mean, would you have tried to possibly, rather than let it get to the stage where all the riots happened, would you have tried to engage maybe differently with the UK?
Well,
looking back now?
No. Look, the UK that was there then, right, was a UK that had before a government with the AACR, where Sir Joshua was convinced that the best thing for Gibraltar was not to have a quarrel with Spain. And therefore, everything he came back with was what he was told
with
to
Britain,
bring back.
not to have a quarrel with Britain, you mean, or with Spain? You said not to have a quarrel with Spain. You meant not to have a quarrel with Britain.
Yeah.
Oh, with Britain?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm talking about Britain.
Yeah.
Because, and therefore, they expected me to be the same, in the sense that they would say this is what is best for Gibraltar, and
you were different, yeah.
And I was different. I mean, I was very clear. Look, I'd spent 15 years in opposition already when I went in, right? I knew what I had wanted to do in all these 15 years, which I had not been able to do. So we went in, and within the first 24 hours that we were in government, what we found was that there were no officers for the minister other than Adolfo, who was full-time. The other ministers were all part-time.
But
so in effect, the transition from the previous government to the government that we were was that we actually had full-time ministers because it was mandatory, working at everything. And when it came to dealing with UK, the decisions were being taken politically all the time.
Do you want to just respond on Sir Joshua's philosophy of not upsetting the British? Obviously, we relied on
He
them.
could be very tough sometimes.
Yeah.
I saw Sir Joshua more than once quarrelling, and when he quarreled, he could be very, very tough. But his attitude was that for many years he had been able to take well, initially the Commonwealth Relations Office, they were always better disposed towards Gibraltar. I think they went out, it's 1969 or so.
Yeah. When they
And
merged the colonial office with the foreign office, it was a disaster for us.
And he thought he could take the Foreign Office along as he had done previously. And that was not the case. And it wasn't... He got on very well with Geoffrey Howe. But Geoffrey Howe had been asked by, of all people, Margaret Thatcher, to try to do something on Gibraltar that would help the then Spanish government in the context of 23F. Because when Calvo Sotelo saw Margaret Thatcher, he became Prime Minister at the time of 23F, and when he saw Margaret Thatcher in number 10, she called Geoffrey Howe and said, Geoffrey, see what some progress can be made with Spain over Gibraltar to aid them in their transition of democracy, I ask you. And Sir Joshua, we went along with the Brussels Agreement, I mean, on that basis. But Sir Joshua then, I think, I said...
Before the moment passes, see the importance of the trigger on termination. We'll come to that later. Sorry,
His great
we are
mistake
going to agree
was
on that.
the airport agreement.
Yeah.
He should have... I don't know whether he was so committed with Geoffrey Howe at the personal level, he should have broken with him over the airport agreement. Because the rest of us ministers... Joe will remember that in the only debate that I presided over in the House of Assembly, I was very careful not to give any indication that we were going to support the airport agreement.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
So-
I think it's also-
the official position that you took was it's a matter that is
For the next government.
the entire...
Okay, so-
But you could be in assessing Hassan. I think it's important to say, look at the fact that for 14 or something of the last 16 years, he was leading a Gibraltar with a closed frontier on the basis of support and sustained by the UK. I mean, you can't have as many rows with the UK when it's support and sustained as you can when Joe Bossano takes over. The UK says, now there's an open frontier, I'm closing the dockyard, I'm cutting all the strings. You might as well have a row like Joe Bossano was having then because they were no longer supporting and sustaining you. So I think you've got to make the judgment about what Hassan does and what Joe does in the proper context.
Absolutely right.
It's all about
And the
context.
answer is the economy.
Yeah.
It's relatively easy to govern Gibraltar with all the problems that we have, but still relatively easy to govern Gibraltar from a position where the government has money and can do things than governing Gibraltar with the same political problems but with no money with which to with no money with what to do it. I mean, at the end of the day, I'm highly conscious that I was in the privileged position of running Gibraltar, of governing Gibraltar with my colleagues for 16 years. I don't think there was anything that we wanted to do.
All my piggyback.
Did you have to...
I don't think that there was anything that we wanted to do that said we can't do it because we haven't got the money to do it. And this is the great difference between the...
Okay, here's the question. So Joe fought for Gibraltar's rights. It damaged the relationship with Britain. You sought to repair relationships and build bridges when you came in.
We tried to generally reposition Gibraltar after that time. Joe,
So, Mr. Picardo, I want to ask you then, when you came back with the GSLP, there was a lot of people saying, oh, we don't want to return to the sort of things that happened in the past. So how did you get over that? And how did you build those bridges?
In London, when Peter Caruana lost the election, before they popped at Water Gardens at GSLP headquarters.
Why did they pop in London?
Yeah, because the relationship had become very fractured, and that is something that I inherited in a positive sense. In other words, what Joe and Peter did was they beat up the Foreign Office enough for different reasons and at different times and in different ways. In order for me to inherit a Foreign Office that was changing anyway and had seen that the Gibraltarians would stand up for their positions. And so I've long said, to each of us around this table, and so that neither Peter, Joe, or Adolfo will be surprised to hear me say it, but I've also said it elsewhere, that I think I was able to say this is the first really post-colonial government of Gibraltar in the view of those in London. Not just because of that relationship that had been, I called it fractured, you might want to describe it in a slightly different way, but also because London was changing. London was evolving from that very establishment foreign office that it had been when it was inherited by Blair, the way that Blair did the positive things that Blair did in the government in the United Kingdom, modernising it in some ways, and the diversity that that Labour government of 97 to 2010 brought, meant that by 2011, the Foreign Office was becoming very diverse as well. And I had the opportunity of doing things in a slightly different way. That's not to say that we haven't had sharp words with the Foreign Office in London on a number of different occasions. Perhaps that's not for now, because it's about the administration I'm still leading. But we've had very difficult moments, ironically, with officials, never with ministers. Right? But that was in the sort of first 4 years, when perhaps they did think that if they couldn't dust off the joint sovereignty proposal, they might be able to dust off this element of us having to understand they might have to have a bilateral conversation about Gibraltar, to which the answer they got back from a GSLP government with Joe Bossano in it could only be one. And it was extraordinarily robust, as you can imagine.
With Brexit, the first thing Margallo said was, I'm going to put my flag in Gibraltar.
Yeah.
And even though you were very
Not
calm...
just my hand, he
No,
said,
not just
also
your
my
hand, and not
flag.
just his hand, the flag. And you were very calm when you went on all these interviews saying, you know, no one's going to touch Gibraltar's sovereignty, blah, blah, blah. But did you, deep down, were you worried that really Gibraltar could have become a pawn? Or were you protected by the double lock on the sovereignty?
No.
On the Constitution?
Gibraltar could never become a pawn, that's clear. And I think there's an element of what Peter was talking about before in the context of joint sovereignty, that when we won with the referendum, the UK understood it had to do things in a different way. That was the United Kingdom's conscience applying to the people of Gibraltar and what they've been put through. In 2016, David Cameron also understood, and he left very quickly after that, but the United Kingdom very quickly understood that Gibraltar was put in an economically precarious position, as we've sometimes said, in the context of the current economic model. That's not to say that there isn't another economic model that we could operate. It might be more uncomfortable, our lives might be less comfortable, but there is a different economic model that we can use, as the United Kingdom used to say for itself, which is to say, we can become Singapore on Thames. Well, we can become Singapore on Straits, and we can do things in a slightly different way, less regulated, more aggressive economically, etc. But we didn't want to go down that road if we didn't have to. And the United Kingdom understood that Gibraltar's sovereignty was never going to be in play, but the current economic model was going to be in play, and therefore they had to support us through the negotiation and do the things which were in its own gift to do without having to involve the EU, namely the Gibraltar authorization regime, which is to maintain the single market in services between Gibraltar and the United Kingdom, which is where most of our business was.
So, Peter, what was your first reaction then after Brexit? Margallo said that. What were your thoughts?
I don't think we were ever in any political danger. I think Margallo's had the consolation of being no worse predictor than his predecessors and all his successors. He can console himself with that thought.
The fruit that never drops.
That never drops. I did think that economically we would go through a period of readjustment. The transition has helped, the transition period has helped, and all of that. I did think we were going to have to refocus our economy. We've always been able to do it successfully. Whenever things have done that have rattled our economic cage, we've always been able to reinvent ourselves appropriately.
Do you have the time?
But it takes time.
Exactly.
It takes time, and because we don't have a huge sovereign wealth fund to tide us over those
chapter.
lean periods. That transition period could have resulted in the need to tighten belts and the need to suppress a little bit our socio-economic prosperity in Gibraltar. And I think that on the whole, that has been avoided. That has been avoided. COVID intervened to some extent. The UK government provided the Gibraltar government with guarantees for borrowing firepower. There's been quite a lot of borrowing. It's been put to the use that that we've all seen. The economy has continued to function, and therefore I think we have avoided the worst of the rupture that Brexit could have been for our economy. I think there is still a need to do some of the economic remodeling. I think the idea that we can just sit on our hands and carry on indefinitely with Gibraltar's current economic model, even in the context of this treaty, I think we all need to recognise that the safest thing for Gibraltar economically is to always keep moving, to always keep changing, to keep diversifying, to have more strings in our bow, not to become over-dependent.
Is that where the focus should be? Is that where the focus should be?
The world is changing all the time. It's not different from that for us.
Exactly.
Is that where the focus should be? I mean, I know we've had a lot of dialogue about what the treaty actually means physically, boots on the ground and all that sort of stuff. We've talked about the termination clause and all of that. But where should the focus really be? We've got the treaty. It's going to be implemented very soon. Should it be on looking at the economic future?
I think, first of all, I think it should be on acknowledging and recognising that the fact that Gibraltar has been able to negotiate and do this treaty, and Gibraltar's political leaders have been able to explain it to the people of Gibraltar, and that the people of Gibraltar have, I think, with surprising calmness, accepted it, is a huge statement to the fact that we are behaving like every other place in the world where politically we accept the realities of the world around us and do whatever is necessary, and we're not anchored in some petrified insecurity of fear because of our past. It's understandable humanly, but it's also a sign of our political maturity that we've been able to outgrow that and decide what is best for us, even at the expense of our fears,
because
notwithstanding our fears.
Because the battle for rights, when you win it, brings you to a reality which is a reality of responsibility. With rights come obligations, the obligation to make up your mind for yourself about what is it that is going to work today for our people. And you cannot become a rabbit stuck in the headlights of history when you've earned the right to represent yourself. You then have to say, well, I'm
rabbits that
representing
get
myself.
stuck in the headlights of oncoming traffic eventually get run over.
Exactly.
But what do we make of the fact?
You've got the right to decide this now. You've got the right to negotiate this and sit at the top table. You have to negotiate at the top table the reality of what is negotiable.
So
and then you have to deliver on that. And I think this is the point that you were making. You have to deliver on that by implementing in a way that is, as I said a little early perhaps, this is the beginning of a new chapter. Where does that chapter take us? Where are the opportunities for further economic diversity, growth in the existing industries, the new industries that we can bring here? And what must we now please learn the lessons of the past, where Joe opened new economic opportunities after the MOD, where those were taken further by Peter and the GSD between 96 and 2011. And although, of course, opposition, whichever party is in opposition, is a duty also to oppose, to analyse and to scrutinise, but to also support the things that may be the new additional economic strings to our bow that we're talking about, that the new treaty can bring us and can make us attractive to. Now, I'm always fascinated by a particular thing, which people may have heard me say before. In 1990s, Joe Bossano was doing Europort to bring banks to Gibraltar for passporting into the European Union. Never really happened. No. But Europort became necessary for gaming companies that had started as telephone betting companies in 1995 that saw the opportunities that the banks had not taken and have now filled Europort. Yeah? So politicians prepare these treaties to allow these opportunities to happen. We might think that it's one industry or another that has the opportunity to prosper. There's an entrepreneur somewhere out there who will see something that we may not have seen, which may become the next big thing that covers 1/3 of our GDP 10 years from now. We have to be ready with the agility to make that happen without putting obstacles in its way and helping those industries, whether it's a data center or whatever else.
So the answer to the question, picking up what Fabian has just left off, is that relying on the self-confidence that has allowed us to negotiate and agree this treaty, and relying on the ability of our political class and our political leaderships to always do whatever is necessary to protect Gibraltar. We've got to seize the economic opportunities that this treaty permits, whilst, of course, at the same time remaining vigilant to see that there is not mission creep in any respect, that this one thing doesn't lead to the other, and the Spain doesn't cross any lines when it comes to the practicalities of the agreement, which we accept. But not be paranoid or nervous, but just be vigilant, just to make sure that this continues to look like Gibraltar Airport, to be Gibraltar Airport, and that if we see Spaniards there, it's because they're performing a Schengen function so that we can travel to France and to everywhere else and to Spain without any difficulty.
But that has been our daily bread, whether it's been at the frontier for the past 30 years, whether it's elsewhere. As you say, Peter, we must not be afraid of that, because we know what we've negotiated and what it means, and that is what it must continue to mean.
I'd like to get Mr. Canepa.
I support the agreement wholeheartedly, the treaty. There's no problem. I think it's a very good deal for Gibraltar. But I don't want to be pessimistic. And it is because I support it that I would like to see it prosper, because Gibraltar will then be able to prosper for the future, for our children. What worries me is that we may get a repetition of what happened with Cordoba. What worries me is that the right wing in Spain, the right, if they come into government, may renege on the treaty. They may not support it. And it's so easy for a Spanish government, we've seen it in the past, it's so easy for them to place a checkpoint at the border. You go through, and 25 meters or 30 meters on, they have a checkpoint. It was done in the past. They can do it again.
How can we guard against that?
So remember that checkpoints cannot be put now in the context of Schengen, other than if you're putting up new barriers to Schengen, which is possible under the Schengen Agreement, but there has to be an objective reason for it. That's set out in the acquis. There are many safeguards. I mean, if you want to talk about what Adolfo is saying, how could they scupper it, and the discussions that we've had in our community in the past 2 weeks about the trigger. Remember that the 4-year trigger, which is the one which gives Spain priority, is in the context of the Schengen evaluation. So it's only in the context of the Schengen evaluation that Spain has a priority trigger to anybody else in stopping the treaty after 4 years. We will have the same priority trigger in the context of the Concordat. Our priority trigger will be about termination completely. Termination completely is dealt with at the end of the treaty in Article 334. The Schengen evaluation, which is the Spanish trigger, I think is in Article 66. There's a different suspension provision also in the treaty. There we have Concordat primacy, such as it may be when we finish and we publish the Concordat. But Spain only has the priority in the context of the Schengen evaluation. That's a very limited priority. Now, if you ask me my view, and I want to be very careful about this because this is crystal ball gazing, and it's me interpreting the politics of what is happening in Spain around the treaty. This is not Cordoba. This is a treaty, as Peter has said. It's a different animal. It's a legal animal, not a political animal.
And the EU is the party.
The EU is the party. The EU has a relationship with the United Kingdom. There are geostrategic reasons why the EU, including Spain, in particular potentially with an Atlanticist Spanish conservative government, will want the UK in the wider tent rather than out of it. Undoing this treaty could upset the apple cart of the reset with the UK or wherever we are in that context 4 years from now. And I think that the Spanish right would very much like to see all of this done and dusted by the Spanish left so that they can, in perpetuity, to take a terminology from another treaty, complain that all of this was done by the socialists and that they're the terrible ones who did this terrible deal, and just get on with it. And I do hope that that is the case. If it isn't the case, well, look, no treaty can ever be a treaty that doesn't have get-out clauses. Even Utrecht has get-out clauses, which the ones that we don't like in particular in terms of first refusal. But we are in a safer place than we have been before, not least because, as we saw when we were full members of the European Union, the United Kingdom pressed the Article 50 trigger and did for us. So we've got to put everything in its context. We've got to have the security that, in fact, this termination clause in any event in our treaty is a longer termination clause than the EU has given in Mercosur, in its Japanese agreement, where most of the EU termination clauses are 6-month termination clauses. Ours is a year. I think we're not going to live soon in a world where that termination clause is ever invoked. But that also does come, as I said before, with responsibility. We cannot give the excuse to Spain or Brussels that we are not complying with our obligations under the treaty. So let's mature now into, as we've matured into negotiation, let's mature now into implementation, so that nobody can say, but the Gibraltarians have failed in their obligation and therefore have a very good reason to press this button now.
Okay, and just before we move on from that point, the point Mr. Canepa raised, Spain might find an inventive way of making things difficult for us. Let's say if the right wing come in again and they find an inventive way of circumnavigating the treaty and doing
Not socialist Spain.
the right wing in Spain. What mechanisms are there for us to...
So there are a number of mechanisms, and I think I was explaining this in the Parliament, but I'll do it here as well. First of all, there is the Corporation Council. So if things are not working under the treaty, the first thing you do is you have a forum where you can raise that in the Corporation Council. And you can say, look, we've got rid of all physical barriers for immigration purposes, and now we have a physical barrier 20 yards down the line. Now, as long as Spain can't say, yes, but because you failed to do X, Y, Z, and we have people coming in another direction, then the Corporation Council is the first place where you try and resolve that. If you can't resolve it, and it's a general issue. Remember, there are subcommittees as well to the Corporation Council where you might resolve these issues. You then go to dispute resolution. And so there's what you might call an inbuilt court in the treaty, which enables you to do dispute resolution. And it's only once you've been through all of those processes that perhaps you're left with no alternative but to either gulp and accept it if you can't deal with it, or press your own termination trigger. But I have to tell you something, Ros. In all of the inventive things that the Spanish have done in the past, there's always been a Gibraltarian inventive way around. When we couldn't have phones, we found phones with 2 SIM cards. When there were queues at the frontier, people had the car in Spain and the motorbike in Gibraltar. There's always been a way found around these things. I do hope that Spain too is maturing into a way, into a process where it might say, well, let's try and do this in a slightly different way and have a relationship which this treaty provides for.
Okay, let me ask you as well.
Hold my breath.
What does this treaty mean, and the recognition of our institutions as well? What does that mean at the United Nations? Will it translate into any progress in delisting?
Article 2 of the treaty is designed to protect us all at the United Nations. So our position at the United Nations is unaffected because Article 2 is very clear, not just about the text of the treaty, but things done under the treaty and conduct under the treaty. So at the United Nations, we do not believe that the British and Gibraltar position will be affected, and the Spanish believe equally that their position is not affected, because this was always a treaty about what happens in Europe, about our access and our ability to work with the European Union, not about what happens in New York at the United Nations. Things might have some element of read across, but Article 2 is like a dam that stops any of that affecting the positions.
Okay, we're going to move on to domestic politics now. Somebody mentioned it earlier on about, I think it was you, Sir Joe, but about the different parties working together. Whenever there's been an existential threat, Gibraltar's politicians have always come together. Do you think, let me put this to Mr. Canepa, do you think that government and opposition should be working more together?
I don't think that government and opposition should have negotiated the treaty together. I think that wouldn't work.
Right.
Even now we have seen a difference of view between mobility and freedom of movement. If they go it together and an issue arises and the opposition walk out, then we have a serious problem. Confidentiality is gone, and they put the government in an impossible position. The government would be seriously weakened in negotiations on a treaty if, having started together with a joint team, if the opposition were to walk out. This is why I say we have to have a strong government that can deal with Spain, that can deal with Britain, and that can stand the test of time in Gibraltar. So I disagree entirely in going it alone. I don't think it's something that works. I don't think I could have worked with Joe on the dockyard issue because he took a completely different view. And I remember he walked out of the meeting with the governor. Remember, Joe? So there are issues on which you can't work together. You can't work together.
Okay, so Peter, your view.
Well, I mean, I've expressed my views on this publicly already. I mean, I tried it, and I think we did it on the slightly less complicated, because there's really only one view we all want to go to on constitutional reform, and and we all contribute to that. I
That was the
acknowledge,
UK, of
I
course.
acknowledge that it's a different kettle of fish, because at the end of the day, we all want as much constitutional advancement as possible. I accept Adolfo's point that a joint negotiating team, however nice the idea sounds in theory, in practice is fraught with practical difficulties, and governments rightly want to take credit for what they achieve, oppositions rightly want to bail out of any forthcoming bad news so they don't get blamed for their election. It's full of practical, as you see with coalition governments around Europe. So it's fraught with practical difficulties. Last week on this programme, I expressed the view that the government could, I think, if it had wanted to, have brought people in, not on a negotiating team basis, but just to keep people informed, perhaps, pick brains, try and use an idea, some sort of consultative, local consultative forum. It could have done that. There could have been some scope for that. I know that. I know it did it. I mean, look, I don't mind admitting that on one or two issues were run past me. What would you think if? What would you think? What would your view be about this possible solution to that problem? Very informal, non-committal on a government's part. I mean, that was done, and I suspect it must have been done with other people too. It's harder to shoot down the opposition's view that there could have been more of that. But it's easier to subscribe to Adolfo's view that a joint negotiating team, I think, would have been fraught with difficulty.
Well, let me start by addressing some of the things that have been said about this. First of all, on constitutions, since 1969 and the Constitutional Conference here, we have always negotiated constitutions together, and I think that would be my attitude too. I'm not going to have time to negotiate a new constitution, but there is a select committee of the House already. That select committee will start work once the treaty is bedded in, and therefore the next iteration of constitutional development will come from the House working together and negotiating together when the time comes with the UK, which is the big difference. People talk about Hassan and Isola having gone together to the United Nations. That is very different to negotiation. I would find it very easy to represent Gibraltar with any of the gentlemen who are around this table sitting next to me, or mine sitting next to them, or indeed even the leader of the opposition being there, Keith Azzopardi, in the context of representation of Gibraltar, which is different when you're dealing with the lowest common denominator issue, which is self-determination, that we all sign up to. That is what Hassan and Isola went to do together. They went to give one speech on the issue of self-determination, on which we all agree.
The first time prepared by UK.
Right. So in terms of how this negotiation has gone, first of all, we've held a number of briefings with the leader of the opposition and others in the course of the past 5 years. We've asked them for ideas, we've had discussions with them, etc. Perhaps they might have wished more. This is also very difficult to do because there is bandwidth and there is time and there is governing to be getting on with. I created something in statute called the Gibraltar Consultative Council. I wanted it to be, indeed, I hope it still will be at some stage, the equivalent of Gibraltar's Privy Council, where people can be briefed on legally private terms. The GSE reaction was to say, we don't want to have the Gibraltar Consultative Council. I think that was a mistake, but I'm perfectly prepared to go back and look at that and see whether that is something that can be done. But I don't think that we could have come back with a treaty of 1,018 pages if people who are vying to win an election together are put in a room together to negotiate the product. Because, as I say to people sometimes, look, you try and negotiate, you try and draft a letter with 5 lawyers in the room. You'll soon say, well, one of us should draft it and the other one should have a look at it. That is really where we are. We have worked with the United Kingdom, with the European Union, with Spain, and with the technical team in Gibraltar to deliver this result. We've briefed people more than anybody else has briefed people because there's a huge complaints in London and huge complaints in Spain about a failure to brief other politicians there. And we are used as the example of those who have briefed the most. And look, and rightly so, because it's actually Gibraltar that's going to be most affected, and we should be doing the most briefing here. But we've done briefings from the minute we have been able to.
And in fact, one of the differences that has arisen at this point is post-treaty agreement is freedom of movement versus frontier fluidity.
Indeed, and that's fundamental.
Can I I ask your opinion on that? It's always good to have a third opinion other than the two people who are sort of in the centre of that argument.
I honestly think that it's at this stage it's a non-issue. We've got the treaty that we've got. That's the
but
best.
Should we have negotiated for freedom of movement?
Well, the government has given a perfectly plausible reason why, as a matter of policy, regardless of what he might not have been able to achieve it, even if they had wanted to. That's a matter of negotiation. But the government has given a perfectly plausible reason, as a matter of policy, as to why they did not try to achieve that. And that is that it would have to be reciprocal, and EU can more easily absorb 38,000 people than we can absorb.
Well, there are
450.
other small EU territories.
There are.
Though,
We
aren't
understand. Look,
But they have membership. They have membership of EFTA,
we
membership of the
are
EEA.
concerned about suddenly people wanting to come to Gibraltar because it's very attractive, right? So if you are saying anybody of the 480 million has got a right which we cannot stop, we cannot be selective about who we allow to come in.
But sorry to I'm not an expert on this, but other territories or countries that have been named, Liechtenstein, Monaco, all small territories.
They're all countries.
Right.
They're all countries.
They are
states.
sovereign states. with
Members of the United
Nations.
Nations.
Yeah.
It's completely different. But look, we've gone further. I mean, I don't think people have
And they're not
looked
members
at the
of the
nuance
EU,
of
and
this.
they haven't got freedom of movement, by the way.
They
But-
haven't, right.
But there's a different type of nuance here, which people need to understand. If you look at the rights of frontier workers in the European Union, between member states, and you look at the right of frontier workers that we have negotiated, they are slightly different. In fact, we have taken out of the rights of frontier workers those rights which people would have had if we'd had freedom of establishment, aka freedom of movement. The right, for example, of a frontier worker to seek housing in the place where he is working. So he lives in one member state, he works in the other, and he seeks housing in that member state. We stopped that.
Yes.
It's not in our treaty for a simple reason, because we have constraints of land, and therefore frontier workers would stop being frontier workers if they applied for housing in Gibraltar and they became resident in Gibraltar. They would then become resident workers. So quite unlike the mobility of workers which is agreed between member states, which includes that right, we haven't just not agreed freedom of movement for the reasons we've explained, we've also denuded the right of frontier workers in the mobility that they have from being able to seek residence in Gibraltar, because that's hugely important to us,
Yeah.
to protect the
And
identity of the Gibraltarian.
Sorry to interrupt you. The other point that I would make is, this is why I keep on saying we've got the deal that we've got. I think it's also important not to lose sight of the fact why we've gone into this, why we started this negotiation. It was to get access into Spain. It was to have a fluid border so that our economy would not suffer the consequences and our socio-economic lifestyle. That is not about free movement. That is about this. It's about Schengen access. And I suppose, look, I'm not saying that it would have been impossible to have negotiated that, but I suppose it would have come at a higher price.
Of course.
You know, if we've paid these prices
and we don't like them
for Schengen, I can only assume that if we had gone for a higher, just to use my boring now formula, if we had gone for a higher price, the price would also have been higher. So, and I don't know if it could have been achieved or not. And frankly, there will be people in Gibraltar with the view that the right to establish a business in Spain and the right to establish a business in Poland is valuable enough to them to have negotiated. I'm not in a position to second guess that.
Okay, I wanted to bring it up because
I think that the government had a negotiating objective for a particular reason, has delivered what it considers to be the best deal available. I have absolutely no grounds on which to doubt that.
Originally, if we look at the original agreement that happened, half an hour before the closure of Brexit, we were only talking about fluidity at the frontier and nothing else, not even goods.
That's what the New Year's Eve agreement was about. That's the mandate we obtained in 2000.
So Ross, it's easy after the event to see, well, could this have been achieved? Could that have been achieved? And I'm going to say that the government might not, if it had tried even harder, achieved a bit more. It would have come at a higher price, and we would have had to have then a different price equation. I think that's why we've got to evaluate what we've got. That the government says that's the best that could have been achieved. I don't think Gibraltar has any reason to doubt that that is true.
Well, you said it yourself in your article, which I thought was...
I have no reason to believe that anybody, frankly...
Okay, I wanted to bring that up because that's been the sort of the debate between the opposition and the government. So I
But
wanted to...
can I just make one
Yeah.
point? Because it comes to the Cordova point that I made in 2011. The treaty is there. The treaty is a treaty that can grow. I mean, there can be changes in the future in the way that the United Kingdom interacts with the European Union. The United Kingdom might join the European Union again. I think it's unlikely, but those things could happen. A future government could say, look, we want to go back and we want to put on the table something which the EU might wish to have in exchange for free movement. We would be against it for all the reasons that we have set out.
Yeah.
But if there were another government that wanted to
Gibraltar
pursue
government
that,
may
could pursue
ask
that.
the EU to
Of course.
expand the treaty with the UK to include free movement.
Exactly.
You see how quickly 2 hours run out, Sir Peter. We're almost at the end. And
Really?
I want to ask about the future
And we're
of
still
politics. Yeah, I want to. We are. I don't know about anyone else. I want to ask about the future of politics in Gibraltar because you've all come up. I know, Sir Peter, you said before you came into politics you weren't too interested in politics. But yourself, Keith Azzopardi, Damon Bossano and Joseph Garcia, you were sort of these young political animals that came up. And Sir Joe, you've got politics in your blood. And Adolfo Canepa, you were in politics for most of your life. I know you were a teacher, first of all. But do we see this calibre of politicians emerging from the youth that we have? We've seen a few pockets.
I spend my time.
We've seen a few pockets.
I spend my time encouraging young people of all ideological and party political persuasions
Absolutely.
to go into politics.
But it's a
because
big
our future
sacrifice,
depends
though.
It is a huge sacrifice. And I mean, I know people think that being
Today?
Chief Minister of Gibraltar is sitting in the back of a chauffeur-driven car. But there is, you know, that people underestimate this. It's quite hard work. But our future depends on it. Our future depends on Gibraltar being able to produce, as it has in the past, not just a succession of chief ministers, but a succession of ministers and ministerial teams that can continue to progress Gibraltar, continue to protect Gibraltar, and advance its rights. And it would be very myopic for any politician of any age to say, well, I don't want more new people to come into politics because who's going to run this place in 10 years' time when even Joe will have retired?
No, I don't know
So
about
Joe's
that.
not retiring.
I don't know about that. But there are people coming through the ranks. I see some on the other side. I see the ones on my side in particular who are much better than I was at that age or ever will be. There are people who are much younger than me who are much better than I am already. And we've got Sam, who's soon to be related to Adolfo, who's just come back from university, who is magnificent. The group around him in the young GSLP. Look, you know what this takes? This takes 2 geeks a year.
There are some very good young people in the GSG.
Right.
And one of the great legacies of what Joe did was this universal education, tertiary education for all. The calibre of what is coming, which is actually now not just doing the things that I was doing with Joseph and Damon and Keith. They're actually in the professions now. That you don't see them like you might, because you see them when they're 16, 17, 18 and in their 20s. Then they disappear into the professions. They then come into the executive committees and they're going to be ready to run this place better than perhaps any of us were when the time came, except perhaps for Joe, who came through the trade union movement that was running Gibraltar.
Yeah.
And then was in charge.
But how important
I
is
spoke
it?
before about what I thought was what I value most about my legacy, and I have always recognised that which you have just mentioned is the most valuable relic of Joe's legacy. We are a mini Dublin, a mini Irish economy with an educated workforce, adaptable to new industries, because so many of our young people have gone to university and have expanded their horizon and have developed themselves as indivials.
Let me
and I have
ask
always
this question.
recognised that was
They're,
a valuable
let me
they're a
ask the
Celtic
question.
tiger.
How
We're an
important-
Iberian panther.
Okay.
Ready to pounce.
How important is it for these politicians to cut their teeth in opposition first?
It's not necessary. I mean, you can see some people who can go straight
All
into
of you
government.
did. So you didn't.
What was the last point
You
you
didn't
made?
cut your teeth in opposition.
Adolfo went straight into government.
No.
Yes, but all three of you did.
Yes, but that doesn't mean that we can't see people do it in a different way and do it better. I mean, you might be some people come straight into government and then continue in government.
I
Peter
don't,
brought
think
some
you could
people.
I don't think you could become chief minister without having been in opposition.
Well,
you just wouldn't understand.
That is the first self-serving domestic political point you have made this evening, and I think you're
And it's
completely
right to
wrong.
the end
I
of the
think you're completely wrong for reasons that your own party demonstrates, because you have brought people into government,
Don't
and
rise
then
to the bait,
you have
Fabian. Don't
brought
rise
people
to
into
the
government
bait.
and sponsored them to be chief ministers.
Don't rise to the bait. Yeah, yes.
It's much more difficult, at least I found it, to be in opposition than in government.
Yes.
I didn't enjoy my 4 years. I think I was a very poor leader of the opposition. That wasn't fun at all, because you can have your say, but the government will have its way.
Exactly.
But government is another matter.
Okay, I'm going to
I
ask
had a
you.
ball in opposition.
You did. There were some fun times there in opposition with the rows going.
But I was
to a-
fashioned. I was fashioned into steel by
Okay.
heavy blows.
How has social media changed politics? How has social media changed
Well,
politics? It's not the same as it used to be.
I think that you now need to ask a further question, because you could ask the question of how has social media changed politics in 2011 and in 2015. Now you need to ask yourself, how has social media changed? And I think social media, to an extent, is making itself irrelevant in some respects, but more relevant in other respects. So you now have to look at trusted media, traditional media, and you have to look at trusted social media. And there has to be parts of social media that you ignore, and that social media which you think is legitimate and that you can rely on. So it has to be much more discerning than it was before in 2011, when it was just starting and it was very easy to just broadcast. I mean, social media is a place where you can broadcast without a national broadcaster to assist you. And people now have to be very discerning about what broadcasts they accept and what broadcasts they reject. And politicians can use social media to reach their constituents and explain their positions in a way that is actually a very good thing. But there's a lot of faff around.
It's a double-edged sword, isn't it? And it could put people
I
off.
look forward to being off social media when I'm no longer in politics.
I don't mind admitting that when I was deciding after I lost the election in 2011, a year later, whether to stay and try and go around the block again or retire, this point featured on my list of reasons not to go around and to retire. I was not willing to embrace social media. The idea that I would spend my time responding on an hour-by-hour basis to criticism of uninformed people, often on social media, that policy decision-making was capable of being influenced by not just for yearly or weekly or monthly popularity, by unpopularity being inflicted on you, by misinformed, half-baked comment on social media, is not something that I was willing to spend the rest of my life doing. I have to say.
I have to thank Facebook for something else.
Call it for cowardice if you want.
But it's absolutely true that, in the same way as politicians can broadcast on social media, the most foolish and unprepared person in the nation can also broadcast on social media and can capture the imagination of people for a moment, and you then have to put out that fire, and that becomes very difficult indeed. And therefore, it has caused as many problems as it may have resolved.
I can imagine. You were lucky; you didn't have to put up with all of that.
For me and for my family, it was a huge financial sacrifice, but it was great fun. I enjoyed it enormously, and I could get away from it all. I could spend a weekend with my family knowing that I wouldn't be bothered by that wretched mobile phone. I could go to the beach for a swim and enjoy it. I could switch on the radio on a Saturday afternoon to listen to the football matches and no one would bother me. I would have to think very, very carefully, very hard today, if I were in the same position, to decide whether I would go into politics.
The young people have been born into that and embrace it.
We're going to move on, because I must ask you one final question, and I'm going to pin you down to 30-second answers. And Colin in the gallery is going to time you all, but I have to ask you all this: what future for Gibraltar do you see? What is the Gibraltar you aspire to? Very quickly, Sir Joe.
Look, I think that you're talking about a world which none of us know how changed it will be. The one thing that we've all agreed on is the importance of adapting to, but we are going to be adapting to the way the world is changing. We're not going to be able to be unchanged when the rest of the world is changing.
Okay.
And that is, we've been able to do it every time we need it, and I think we can do it again.
Okay. Mr. Canepa, how?
The world is as dangerous today, if not more dangerous than it was in the 1930s. That is very, very worrying. But I have great confidence in the people of Gibraltar. We are very adaptable, we are tough, we punch above our weight, and I have no doubt that in the same way as our generations have prospered, future generations of Gibraltarians will also prosper.
Sir Peter.
To the extent that it depends on us and our efforts and our abilities and our political and our collective wisdom as a people, Gibraltar will continue to prosper in every respect. To the extent that it doesn't depend on us because of the global events that Joe has said, we will have to do the best we can in those circumstances. I've always said that Gibraltar is good at surviving global events, but much more vulnerable to local events.
Okay.
Borders in particular. Subject to that, look, we can't protect ourselves from what no one can protect themselves against.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Picardo, what future do you see for Gibraltar?
So I agree entirely with Joe, Adolfo, and Peter, but I want to just take it to a different level. I think that apart from that prosperity, the key thing that I see for Gibraltar is the ability of its political representatives to continue to represent the wishes of its people at every top table where our issues are being determined, continue to punch above our weight, and in the context of that world that Joe is talking about, what this treaty does is ensure that in this critical moment, instead of being put back into a gilded cage, we have access to that whole wide world that is before us, which is real and is virtual and is as much of an opportunity as it is a danger.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure having you all here. Sir Joe, Mr. Picardo, Mr. Canepa, Sir Peter, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for watching as well. It's been a delightful viewpoint to bring to you. We'll be back next week at the same time. Good night.